Hi, I'm Max Keiser.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
This is the Keiser Report. Let's talk about myotonia congenita. Do you know what that is? We're going to find out. Stacy Herbert?
Exactly, Max. I officially have a diagnosis for the fainting traders of Wall Street.
The fainting traders of Wall Street. Do continue.
You know, the markets have been up and down, up and down, up and down, wild over the last 2 weeks. Well, it made me think of the fainting goats of Tennessee, domestic breeds of goats in America, which have a genetic disorder called myotonia congenita, which is when startled, younger goats will stiffen and fall over, as you see from this image here. They just fall over and freeze for 10 seconds. They don't get hurt, but they get up and start walking again like normal, like nothing happened. But this is what we see in the markets.
Yeah, well, how do you apply the fainting goats of North Carolina to what we see in the marketplace?
Well, I think it's a genetic disorder, so I think we see inbreeding in the financial markets. This is the first headline, Max. Wall Street aristocracy got $1.2 trillion in Fed's secret loans. So, as you know, one of the consequences of aristocracy is often you see inbreeding. So I thought this is what you're seeing, is that the Fed is breeding a class of bankers who freeze and startle and fall over because it generates attention from their owner, the central bank.
And they, like, fall on the sell button, and stocks collapse, and then they wake up and they quick buy everything back. Now, also, I might add that this whole idea of inbreeding as it relates to Wall Street aristocracy that was gifted over $1 trillion by the Fed. It also reminds me of the word derivatives. Derivatives are referential. They refer to itself after generation upon generation of trading algorithms that have created this kind of inbred, ogre-like monster on Wall Street that only refers to itself and not the general economy or anything anyone is saying in Washington.
So let's turn to this story here. So the Wall Street aristocracy. Fed Chairman Ben S. Bernanke's unprecedented effort to keep the economy from plunging into depression included lending banks and other companies as much as $1.2 trillion of public money. And Max, this is the most important part of this sentence. It goes on, about the same amount U.S. homeowners currently owe on 6.5 million delinquent and foreclosed mortgages.
Right. The numbers work out here. Banks made over $1 trillion in loans that they knew could never be repaid because they were lending it to people who had no income, no assets, no job. But they knew that they would be bailed out by the Fed to that exact amount of money. And let's be honest, this isn't a $1.2 trillion loan. This is a $1.2 trillion gift. On Wall Street, they call it a forgivable loan, which is code for gift.
So the largest borrower was Morgan Stanley, and they got as much as $107.3 billion, which was 3 times as much as the company's total profits over the previous decade.
These are the company's profits. If there wasn't for this gifting from the Fed to these banks, their profits would be zero. Their stock valuations, by the way, are crashing. Their liabilities are skyrocketing. That's why most people in the know will tell you that banks, particularly in France right now, and I'm thinking of Société Générale, are about to declare bankruptcy because they are beyond insolvent. They're insolvent times 40.
The other thing, Max, is now when it comes to this matter of compensation by a lot of these bailed out banks, they're saying it's the free market and we have to allow the free market to reign because otherwise we become socialist and Marxist and blah, blah, blah. But according to the Bloomberg article, even as the firms asserted in news releases or earnings calls that they had ample cash, they drew Fed funding in secret, avoiding the stigma of weakness. So I ask you, Max, where is the price discovery in there?
Well, you make an excellent point. Price discovery, of course, being at the heart of free market capitalism, the nexus between supply and demand. If it's all in secret and it's without Bloomberg's request for information for FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, we wouldn't even know about this $1.2 trillion gift. And I'm sure that there's 10 to 20 times more of the gifts behind that. But there is no price discovery. There's price fixing. That's what we're discovering here. We're discovering price fixing, and we're not discovering price discovery.
And now, if my math is correct, you know, in the UK, the royalty there often sells himself to the public, saying that the Queen only costs 69p per taxpayer to keep the royal household. So the royal households in America, however, I figure that 1.2 trillion divided by 300 million equals $4,000 per American. So I think that's like 4,000 pints of milk rather than 1 pint of milk that the Queen costs.
Yeah, well, the point being that the average American is subsidizing Wall Street aristocracy. And it's curious that they use the word aristocracy because it goes right back to the whole point of America to begin with, was presumably to stage a freedom, a revolution of independence against aristocracy. And here we are 240 years later, back in the jaws of an entrenched aristocratic class that treats the entire economy as rent-seeking, troglodytic schmuckoka. That's a new word I've just invented. Another neologism from Max Keiser on this show.
The other thing that is important, remember we've just been discussing recently how the population in the UK doesn't seem to mind so much the wholesale looting of the economy by the top, but the looting by the bottom, they go crazy. And you see this, again, in this story as well about the aristocracy in America. The $1.2 trillion peak on December 5th, 2008, the combined outstanding balance under the 7 programs tallied by Bloomberg was almost 3 times the size of the U.S. federal budget deficit that year. So again, federal budget deficit, huge story, riling up the masses. Where is it about the banks? Why don't they care about it?
Right, the debt ceiling debate that agonized Washington for weeks compared to $1.2 trillion in looting. And again, yes, the point you make is a good one. You can't castigate looters on the street in London and point to them as being morally reprehensible while at the same time being accommodating for the looting going on in the banking system in the City of London. And I don't understand why this is such a stretch for David Cameron. And I see Tony Blair opened his pie hole last week and started to moralize, now that he's good friends with the Pope, about what really should be done in a society that respects human rights, while he is the guy who oversaw the transformation of the City of London into a looting economy, not to mention the human rights abuses and genocide that Blair committed in Iraq.
Well, so you know Tony Blair was good friends with the guy with the farting camels of Tripoli.
What? The farting camels of Tripoli back on the show?
Well, now Blair is, of course, one of these fainting bankers of Wall Street. So this also brings me to continue with this myotonic markets theme. Remember, these guys have myotonia.
This is a Stacy Herbert original. Yeah. Myotonic markets theme. M.
Headline reads, Max, Bernanke under pressure to calm markets. So, you know, Ben Bernanke is speaking at Jackson Hole tomorrow, and he's under pressure to calm these markets. Remember, I said these fainting goats, they faint when they're startled. So these goats, these banking goats, are threatening to pass out again. But I want to bring up one thing about these fainting goats. According to the Wikipedia, older goats learn to spread their legs or lean against something when startled, and often they continue to run about in an awkward, stiff-legged shuffle. So you don't need to faint. If these bankers can just come up with an awkward, stiff-legged shuffle, they can still stay standing, you know?
The awkward, stiff-legged shuffle could be the dance craze of the season. Remember, under Gaddafi's recent expatriation, they had the, what was it called, the Zumba Zumba or the
Zenga Zenga?
The Zenga Zenga dance. This is the awkward standing banker dance. So if you see, in other words, Ben Bernanke leaning up against the wall with his goat-like beard, you know, going, Q3, Q3, Q4, Q5, you know that he's trying to stop himself from fainting due to market myotonia congenita.
Yeah, I imagine this is what we'll be seeing tomorrow in Jackson Hole. Ben Bernanke leaning up against the wall, a whole bunch of younger bankers passed out on the ground, startled, like frozen.
That's a good time to round them all up and come up with a nice recipe for shish kebab. Put them on a skewer.
So Max, yes, he's being asked to calm the markets because there's something like $8 trillion has been wiped off global markets in the last 2 weeks in these wild...
A mere bag of shells!
Well, speaking of a bag of shells, the UK population barely has that if you look at this headline. UK household finances are worse than during the height of the recession.
Yeah.
So again, while the fainting bankers of Wall Street are out there in Jackson Hole begging for money, the actual population who is out there banging on the drums asking people to lock up the little poor people, well, their household budgets are deteriorating at a faster rate than during the height of the recession in early 2009, according to an analysis of consumers' finances.
This was my message to the middle classes in Britain who are, you know, all upset about the young looters out there in the street. You need to join them. You need to talk to them. You need to join them. You need to understand what they're talking about there, because you're next. Financial apartheid only grows if there's nobody willing to shut down financial apartheid. So all of you middle-class Brit people, take all that marmite off your naked bodies, put your clothes on, go out in the street, stop dogging, and start talking.
And then finally, with this whole, shift in wealth that's happening around the world as part of this financial collapse is what it's really about. India gold imports may reach a record. So as gold prices are soaring, we find that the biggest buyers in the world, Indians, they're increasing their consumption of gold. Purchases by India, the world's biggest user, surged 60% to 267 tons in the 3 months ended June 30th from 167 tons a year earlier. Investment demand, Max, jumped 78% to 108.5 tons.
Well, because, let me tell you something, analysts confuse this whole Indian gold buying phenomenon. Of course, for years they buy it during the wedding season, and they buy it as a gift, as a store of value, etc. So people assumed that when the price moved higher, that this would be a deterrent to buying gold at these high prices. But Indians are not stupid. They realize that all fiat currencies around the world are being debased. They've already had the experience of buying gold. They've already seen their gold double, triple, hitting new all-time record against the rupee. So that's it's an installed customer base of gold buyers. It's a reason to think gold's going to triple again. People who say, oh no, they're not going to buy it, it's too high.
Yeah.
That's like saying, wow, that first hit of heroin, it got me so high, I'm never going to do it again. Does that make any sense? No! Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
That's going to do it. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with much more, so stay there.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology from around Russia.
We've got the future covered. Permission free. Accreditation free. Transport charges free. Arrangement free. Risk free. Stereotype free. Download free broadcast quality video for your media projects at freevideo.rt.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Massachusetts. Talk with Chris Martenson. Chris Martenson, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Good to be here.
All right, Chris Martenson, markets have been extremely volatile for the last 2 weeks. Is this the resumption of what we saw in 2008 or something new?
Well, it's both. I think it's a lot like 2008. We have credit spreads blowing out all over the place. If we keep our eye on the ball, remember, this is a monetary crisis at its heart, but we mostly witnesses as a fiscal crisis or financial crisis. So I'm looking at the financial sector. You look at the BKX or some of the indicators that are around maybe the insurance sectors, and you're seeing a lot of distress there. The BKX broke below the former lows in this rundown, and so that's where we're seeing the stress. I mean, obviously, when you have credit spreads blowing out, you have Europe, huge debt crisis. So those are the echoes of 2008. What's different this time is gold and silver, signaling that maybe this time I think people are understanding that this is a monetary crisis too. It's not just some weakness in the financial sector.
All right, Chris Martenson, I saw an interesting statistic a couple of days ago that all of the market capitalizations of something like the 28 biggest banks in continental Europe, if you add them together, they still wouldn't equal the market capitalization of one company, Apple Computer. I think that says certainly a lot about Apple Computer, but more importantly, it says a lot about the European banking system. Their market capitalization and these banks in Europe and in the U.S. seem awfully thin when you look at the amount of debt they're carrying.
The bottom line here is that this is fundamentally a crisis of insolvency. It always has been a crisis of insolvency. The big banks are trying to treat it as a crisis of liquidity. They're begging the ECB, they're begging the Federal Reserve, just give us liquidity. You saw the Federal Reserve, a wonderful report by Bloomberg came out, showed that the Federal Reserve supplied over $1 trillion of actual cash liquidity. And even that wasn't sufficient to patch the hole in the ship. It's really fundamentally an insolvency situation. That's what we're going to have to face up to. I think that's where we're going in this next leg of this downturn.
All right, we'll get to that $1.2 trillion gift from the Fed in a second. But I want to go back to what you just said, talking about the interconnectivity or the daisy chain aspect of these banks. I'm thinking back to 2008. It was revealed that Lehman Brothers had their own little pet bank, that they would hide their debts before each reporting quarter was needed. This is part of what you could look up and find out, the Repo 105 scandal. They had this bank, they were hiding debts, and they were shuttling back and forth to avoid the regulatory scrutiny and to avoid the disclosure of all their debt. It seemed to me that that particular scam of peekaboo accounting or debt shuttling is done on a huge global scale. To play into what you're saying, how much of that is incidental? How much of that is more has more of a nefarious twist to it?
I think it's much more widespread than is commonly believed. Anybody who thinks that Repo 105 began and ended with Lehman and that we got that one bad apple out of the barrel really needs to have their head examined. This is clearly common practice. There's all kinds of accounting tricks and shenanigans that can be done. Let's face it. Wall Street can afford the best and the brightest, and they are just outgunning and outmanning government regulators at every turn, and that's not even including the revolving door, where sometimes those very same perpetrators of these scams go through the revolving door into the regulatory apparatus.
Would it be wrong to say that when people talk about the shadow banking system, as Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of Britain, called it, what percentage of that shadow banking system would account for this type of fraudulent debt shuttling to avoid regulatory scrutiny, would you guess?
On a percentage basis, it's hard to say, but here's one number I go by. We look at the number of mortgages that are either delinquent or in default, and it's over 1 in 10 at this point in time. So we look at the total size of the mortgage market, and we find it's over $10 trillion. So rounding vigorously here, we find that there's $1 trillion in losses somewhere. Where are those? If we go back through all of the losses that have been reported so far through the putative holders of those same mortgages, we don't find $1 trillion missing anywhere. We find a fraction of that. And so without the ability to have real regulators come in and force this mark-to-market, which we abandoned, by the way, quite willingly and openly. We abandoned mark-to-market and allowed them to do mark-to-fantasy. And that's the world we live in. And this is the important point. Our markets are really, really driven by confidence. They require confidence. People, investors, have to have the sense that they know where the hidden risks are. People don't know where the risks are at this point. And for good reason, because every time we scratch under the surface, we find another huge example of where things have been hidden.
Okay, so you're saying you can't hide these massive multi-trillion-dollar debts forever. However, the Federal Reserve Bank under Ben Bernanke, it seems that their solution is to try to keep interest rates at 0% forever so that the liability and interest costs associated with these debts will never have to be paid. There's a Jackson Hole meeting coming up. He's being asked by the market to do something in the face of all these calamities. Number one, can he do anything? Number two, am I right to say that the 0% interest rate policy is an attempt to keep the multi-trillion-dollar debt burden permanently hidden in a closet somewhere.
It's certainly an attempt. The entire rescue, such as it was, starting in 2008 to current, really has to be called by its proper name, which was the Rescue the Big Bank Balance Sheet Act of 2008. I mean, this has always been about repairing the balance sheets of the big financial institutions. I picked on big banks there, but it's really the whole financial network, of which the shadow banking system is one part, but we've got pension funds, we've got insurance funds, we've got the entire fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate, the whole sector. Everything Bernanke's been attempting to do is to get credit flowing again, because that was his diagnosis. We had too little credit flowing through the system, and he's done everything he can to get that credit flowing again. And every step he's taken has been right if that was your diagnosis. But from my diagnosis, the patient was suffering from too much debt, not too little credit. And so what we have to do is recognize that those debts can't be paid back under current dollar terms, and there's no possible way to dig out from this using current production. And somebody's going to have to eat those losses. Politicians step into the fray. Every step of the politicians, with the exception of maybe Iceland, have so far come forward and said, we want the taxpayers to eat those losses. Guess what? People are starting to catch on to that whole story. We look at Europe, a lot of very unhappy people there expressing themselves in the street saying this doesn't feel right, and there's good reason for that. It's not correct. I think the central banks have fundamentally failed to look at this problem in the right way.
Okay, you mentioned Iceland. So let's use Iceland as an example of a policy of letting the banks fail, come what may, picking up the pieces thereafter, and moving forward. And on the other extreme, I guess you'd have to point to a country like Japan that has supported their banking system now for 20 years through this zombie banking period of not realizing the losses and eating up their entire country's savings and now going into a period of rapid decline. So those are the two choices. And first of all, for those who argue that it would be impossible for America to have experienced an Icelandic-type repudiation of the debts and simply allow banks to fall, the too big to fail banks, what do you say to them? And second of all, are you saying basically that we're stuck in a Japan-like zombie economy?
Well, first of all, we are absolutely getting ourselves stuck in a Japanese zombie-like economy. And to those who would say, listen, these banks were too big to fail, it would have been too disruptive, think about the deflationary impacts that would have happened. This could have led to all kinds of things potentially uncontrolled. You had Hank Paulson at the time back in 2008 walking into Congress mentioning things like martial law and very scary things that everybody wanted to avoid. At the same time we're having those too big to fail discussions, we'd had too little of the discussion around the idea of too big to save. If something is just too large to save, then everything we're doing in attempting to avoid too big to fail, what we're doing is wasting time, wasting resources, shoveling trillions where they're actually doing no good. They're just disappearing into a black hole. We're not getting any new bridges out of the deal. Our energy infrastructure isn't being overhauled. We have no new educational initiatives. We don't have any investments back. All we're doing is taking sunk costs, that is wrecked debt. What Joseph Schumpeter would call creative destruction should have been happening, isn't happening, but guess what? It can't be hidden forever. It's going to come out, and in the meantime, what we've done is, very unfortunately, wasted a lot of time and a lot of resources attempting to sustain the unsustainable. That's the way I look at it, and I think the markets are starting to confirm that view, and more people are coming around to that, which means we may still have a very destructive wave of financial instability in front of us. It's actually what I think is most likely at this point in time, and we have a fiscal situation which is deteriorated at the periphery and is starting to deteriorate towards the center, very visible in Europe at this point in time, but it's going to come to the U.S. eventually.
Yeah, I mean, really, to add insult to injury, the U.S., on top of all this, is spending trillions fighting tyrants overseas and doing nothing about fighting the tyrants on Wall Street. Now, you mentioned this $1.2 trillion, so we talked about it briefly, this gift that was disclosed through the Freedom of Information Act that Bloomberg put forward, and the secret loans that went to the banks and their individuals at these banks and the CEOs at these banks. And this is really the emergence of what some are now calling an aristocracy in the U.S. Is the public now beginning to understand that they're living under an aristocratic monarchical system again, that the whole revolutionary war for independence was basically now we've got a round trip back to feudalism?
I'd like to say yes, but it's not clear to me that we really have cracked the 1% barrier in terms of awareness of what's really going on here. Not only do we have regulatory capture, we have media capture. All of this is very predictable effect of what happens when you do have high concentration of moneyed interests that are allowed to own all sorts of things, ranging from politicians to cable news stations to newspapers. So I think a lot of people are starting to, in my line of work, I find more and more people who are voting with their feet, as it were, trying to find ways to protect their assets, pull their assets out of a system that they see as fundamentally asymmetrical, corrupt even, one that favors one party over another, that is the advantaged party over everybody else. And so we're starting to see that. You look at retail money flows into mutual funds, and I think that's telling part of the story. We look at the price of gold, we're seeing the story told again. There are clues all over the place that people are fundamentally walking away from what they see as a rigged game, and they're very unhappy about having to do that because we don't have any alternative currencies in the U.S. There is no border we can go across. We're not like Zimbabwe where we can use a U.S. dollar if we choose, or we could hide our savings in rands or whatever the border currency happens to be. The United States, we're really captive over here. And so this is the thing I'm experiencing most, are people asking the question, how do I dodge what seems to be a very giant bullet that I can't control, there's nothing I can do about? So, here we are, facing, the prospect of QE3 or, some other big bailout or another series of bailouts, and we don't even have any faith that when they announce it, like, look, they told us about QE2, that was nice, but that was a fraction of the size of the secret bailout that was happening behind closed doors. So people get the sense that, yes, there's huge amounts of money, it's flowing all over the place, but not to them. It's going to the well-connected, and this is really an unfortunate dynamic because our markets, again, require confidence in order to stay in them. Who can have confidence in these markets watching the volatility, seeing where the money is flowing, not understanding where the risks really lie, knowing in their heart of hearts that there are balance sheet disasters just squirreled away? It's intense. It's a very, very profound period of instability we're in.
All right, go long pitchforks, I guess is the message. Chris Martenson, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Chris Martenson. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.